For 36 straight hours, a sound echoed through Robert Hartwell's $50 million estate that would break even the strongest man. The desperate cries of his 6-month-old son pierced through marble hallways and mahogany walls, creating a symphony of desperation that money couldn't silence. 12 world-class nannies had failed. 7 pediatric specialists from the country's most prestigious hospitals had thrown up their hands in defeat. Security cameras captured the endless parade of exhausted professionals walking away from the nursery door, unable to provide what this billionaire steel magnate needed most: peace for his child. But in the early morning hours of day 3, when hope seemed lost and Robert's empire felt powerless against the cries of one small baby, a 19-year-old maid named Sarah Williams would do what no expert could accomplish. What happened next would shatter everything Robert thought he knew about class, family, and the invisible people who work in the shadows of wealth. The moment Sarah entered that nursery, she would uncover a truth so profound that it would change 2 lives forever and expose a secret that had been buried for nearly 2 decades. This isn't just a story about a crying baby or a desperate father. This is about the moment when privilege met purpose, when assumptions crumbled, and when the most unlikely person became the answer to an impossible problem. Before we explore this extraordinary tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about who has value in this world. Robert Hartwell didn't inherit his fortune. He clawed his way from a Pennsylvania steel town where his father worked double shifts in the mills just to keep food on the table. By age 25, Robert had transformed a small machining operation into Hartwell Industries, a manufacturing empire that would eventually stretch across 3 continents. His rise through America's industrial hierarchy was methodical and ruthless, earning him respect in boardrooms and fear among competitors. The business magazines loved his story, the working-class kid who built a billion-dollar dynasty through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. But success demanded sacrifices that Robert would later come to understand in the most painful way possible. 16-hour workdays became his norm. Business trips stretched into weeks. The pursuit of the next acquisition, the next breakthrough, the next victory consumed every waking moment. When he met Elizabeth Morrison at a charity gala in Manhattan, she represented something his life had been missing: grace, warmth, and a perspective that extended beyond profit margins and market share. Elizabeth came from old New York money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted, that valued art and culture over stock portfolios. Their wedding was a merger of new wealth and established society, photographed by every major publication and attended by titans of industry and politics. For 5 years, their marriage seemed to balance Robert's driving ambition with Elizabeth's refined sensibilities. She softened his edges while he energized her world. They built a life that looked perfect from the outside: homes in the Hamptons and Manhattan, charitable foundations bearing their names, and social circles that included celebrities, politicians, and fellow billionaires. Elizabeth became pregnant after years of trying, and for the first time in his adult life, Robert began to imagine a future where success wasn't measured solely in dollars and market dominance. The baby represented hope for a legacy that extended beyond corporate achievements. But childbirth complications that no amount of money could prevent took Elizabeth's life just hours after their son James entered the world. Robert Hartwell, a man who had conquered every challenge through strategy and resources, faced the one defeat that left him completely powerless. In a single day, he became both a father and a widower, responsible for a tiny life while grappling with grief that threatened to consume him entirely. Sarah Williams arrived at the Hartwell estate on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying nothing more than a small duffel bag and hopes of earning enough money to keep her grandmother's medical bills from destroying what remained of their family. At 19, she had already experienced more hardship than many people face in a lifetime. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12, leaving her in the care of a grandmother whose arthritis made even basic tasks increasingly difficult. Sarah worked 3 jobs: early morning shifts at a diner, afternoon cleaning at an office building, and weekend hours at a grocery store, all while finishing her high school education through night classes. The job at the Hartwell mansion came through a staffing agency that specialized in domestic help for wealthy families. The pay was better than anything Sarah had ever earned, and the live-in arrangement would save money on rent that she couldn't afford anyway. The agency briefed her on the basic requirements: light housekeeping, laundry, and general maintenance tasks. They mentioned that Mr. Hartwell was a widower with a young baby, but the infant care would be handled by professional nannies. Sarah's role was to remain invisible, efficient, and unobtrusive in the daily operations of a household that functioned like a small corporation. Her first week at the estate was a crash course in how the ultra-wealthy lived. The mansion contained 43 rooms, including a library with first-edition books, an art collection worth more than most people's annual salaries, and technology systems that controlled everything from lighting to security with the touch of a button. A full staff of 12 people maintained the property: gardeners, security personnel, a personal chef, housekeepers, and the rotating team of nannies responsible for baby James. Sarah quickly learned that each staff member had specific duties and boundaries that weren't to be crossed. The baby's nursery was located on the second floor, and Sarah was explicitly instructed to avoid that area during her shifts. Mr. Hartwell had made it clear that childcare was the exclusive domain of trained professionals, and the household staff was expected to focus on their assigned responsibilities without interference. Sarah respected these boundaries, but during her evening cleaning duties she couldn't help but notice the constant activity around the nursery. Nannies arriving and departing at all hours, medical professionals consulting in hushed tones, and an underlying tension that seemed to permeate the entire second floor. From her third-floor room in the staff quarters, Sarah could hear the baby crying at night. It wasn't the normal fussing that babies do when they're hungry or need changing. This was something deeper, more desperate, a sound that seemed to echo through the walls and into her dreams. She had experience with crying babies from helping neighbors in her old apartment building, and something about James's cries felt different, almost urgent in a way that made her chest tighten with concern. The crying began on a Wednesday evening at exactly 7:23, according to the security system timestamps that Robert would later obsess over. What started as typical baby fussing escalated into something that defied every expert opinion and professional recommendation. James Hartwell, who had been a relatively content infant since birth, suddenly began crying with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the massive estate. The night nanny, a woman with 15 years of experience caring for children of the wealthy and powerful, tried every technique in her considerable repertoire: feeding schedules, temperature adjustments, swaddling methods, and comfort routines that had worked with dozens of other infants. By midnight, the crying had intensified rather than subsided. Robert, who had been working late in his study, found himself pacing the hallways as the sound penetrated every corner of the house. The night nanny called in reinforcements, and by 2 in the morning, 3 additional childcare specialists were consulting in the nursery. They checked for signs of illness, examined the baby for any physical discomfort, adjusted room temperature and lighting, and implemented feeding and sleeping schedules developed by top pediatric experts. Nothing worked. If anything, James seemed to become more distressed as the hours passed. Thursday brought a parade of medical professionals. Robert's personal physician arrived first, followed by a pediatric specialist from Boston Children's Hospital, and then a consultant who had trained at the Mayo Clinic. They ran every test imaginable: blood work to check for infections, examinations for physical abnormalities, neurological assessments to ensure brain function was normal. The results showed a perfectly healthy 6-month-old baby who, for reasons no one could explain, would not stop crying. The medical team was baffled. They had treated thousands of infants and had never encountered a situation where a healthy baby cried continuously without any identifiable cause. By Thursday evening, 24 hours into the ordeal, Robert had called in specialists from 3 different hospitals. A sleep consultant flew in from California, a feeding expert arrived from Chicago, and a child psychologist who specialized in infant trauma joined the growing team of professionals. The nursery had been transformed into a makeshift medical facility, with monitors tracking everything from the baby's heart rate to the room's air quality. Still, James continued to cry with a consistency that was both heartbreaking and mystifying. Friday morning marked the beginning of hour 36, and the atmosphere in the Hartwell mansion had shifted from concern to something approaching desperation. Robert hadn't slept in 2 days, and the sound of his son's cries had begun to affect every person in the household. Several staff members had requested transfers to other duties, unable to concentrate on their work with the constant noise. The team of professionals, now numbering more than a dozen, were beginning to run out of explanations and solutions. They had tried every medical intervention, every comfort technique, and every environmental adjustment they could think of. What made the situation even more troubling was that James would only quiet down for brief moments when he exhausted himself to the point of falling asleep, but within minutes of waking, the crying would resume with renewed intensity. The professionals began to whisper about rare conditions they had only read about in medical journals, disorders that might require specialized treatments or institutional care. Robert, a man accustomed to solving problems through action and resources, found himself facing the most important challenge of his life, with a growing sense of helplessness. Sarah Williams had been lying awake in her third-floor room for 3 nights, listening to the baby's cries with a growing sense of anguish that she couldn't ignore. Her grandmother had often told her that some people are born with a gift for understanding pain, and Sarah had always seemed to know when something was truly wrong, versus when someone was simply seeking attention. The sound coming from the nursery wasn't manipulation or normal infant fussing. It was genuine distress, a cry for help that seemed to be going unanswered despite the army of professionals working around the clock. On Friday morning at 3:47, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had been raised to respect authority and follow rules, especially when working for people who held her financial future in their hands. But the sound of that baby's cries had awakened something in her that was stronger than fear of losing her job. She slipped out of her room and made her way down to the second floor, moving quietly through hallways she had been instructed to avoid during these specific hours. The scene outside the nursery was one of controlled chaos. 2 nannies sat in chairs looking exhausted and defeated, while a pediatric specialist paced the hallway speaking quietly into his phone. Through the slightly open nursery door, Sarah could see more professionals huddled around charts and medical equipment, their voices tense with frustration and concern. She had never seen so many adults look so helpless, and the baby's cries seemed to be growing weaker, as if James was running out of energy to signal his distress. Sarah knew she was about to cross a line that could cost her the job she desperately needed, but something deep in her core told her that this baby needed something the experts weren't providing. She approached the nursery door slowly, and when one of the nannies noticed her, the woman's expression immediately shifted to alarm. Before anyone could speak, Robert Hartwell appeared in the hallway, his face showing the strain of 3 sleepless nights and the weight of watching his son suffer without being able to help. The confrontation that followed would later be described by witnesses as electric with tension. Robert's first instinct was anger at seeing the young maid in an area she had been explicitly told to avoid. His voice, usually controlled and authoritative, carried an edge of desperation as he demanded to know what she thought she was doing. Sarah's response was quiet but firm, her words carrying a conviction that surprised everyone present, including herself. She told Robert that she had heard something in his son's cries that the others might have missed, something that reminded her of her own little brother who had died when she was 16. The mention of her deceased brother seemed to stop Robert in his tracks. The professionals in the hallway grew quiet, and for a moment the only sound was James's continued crying from inside the nursery. Sarah explained that her brother had cried similarly before he died, not from illness, but from something the doctors had never identified. She said she had learned to recognize the difference between a baby crying from physical needs and one crying from something deeper, something that had to do with feeling lost or disconnected from the world around them. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when conventional wisdom collided with intuition, when years of professional training met the raw understanding that sometimes comes from lived experience rather than textbook knowledge. Robert Hartwell, a man who had built his empire by trusting data and expert analysis, found himself facing a decision that went against every logical instinct he possessed. The 19-year-old maid standing before him had no medical training, no childcare certification, and no credentials that would qualify her to succeed where specialists had failed. But something in Sarah's voice when she mentioned her brother cut through Robert's exhaustion and desperation. He had heard grief in his own voice every day since Elizabeth's death, and he recognized that same quality of loss in the young woman's words. Against the protests of several professionals and his own better judgment, Robert made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped aside and allowed Sarah to enter the nursery where his son had been crying for 36 straight hours. The nursery fell silent as Sarah approached the crib where baby James lay, his small face red from crying and his tiny fists clenched in distress. The medical monitors continued their electronic beeping, and the assembled professionals watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as the young maid reached down and gently lifted the infant. What happened in the next few moments would defy every expectation and challenge every assumption about who has the ability to heal and comfort. Sarah held James against her chest and began to hum a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. It wasn't a lullaby she had learned from a book or heard on the radio. The tune was something her grandmother had sung to her when she was small, a wordless melody that had comforted Sarah through her own darkest moments. As she hummed, she began to sway gently, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the baby's heartbeat rather than fighting against his distress. The change was gradual at first, so subtle that some of the professionals weren't sure they were seeing it. James's cries began to soften, becoming less frantic and more like the normal fussing of a tired infant. Sarah continued humming, her voice low and soothing, while she moved around the nursery in a slow, deliberate pattern. She wasn't trying to stop the crying through force or technique, but seemed to be acknowledging it, accepting it, and offering comfort without demanding that the distress end immediately. Within 20 minutes, something extraordinary happened. Baby James's cries subsided completely, and for the first time in 36 hours the Hartwell mansion was truly quiet. The infant's breathing became regular and peaceful, and his small body relaxed against Sarah's chest, as if he had finally found what he had been searching for. The assembled professionals stood in stunned silence, unable to explain what they had just witnessed, or why their combined expertise had been less effective than the intuitive actions of an untrained teenager. In the profound silence that followed James's first peaceful moments in 3 days, Robert Hartwell experienced something he hadn't felt since Elizabeth's death. A mixture of relief and bewilderment that left him questioning everything he thought he understood about expertise, intuition, and the nature of human connection. The medical professionals began to pack up their equipment and clear their notes, unable to offer any scientific explanation for what had just occurred. Their tests had shown nothing wrong with the baby, and their interventions had failed where Sarah's simple presence had succeeded. But as Robert watched Sarah continue to hold his son, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The melody she was humming was achingly familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he had heard it before. The tune seemed to awaken memories that had been buried under months of grief and business concerns. As Sarah's voice continued its wordless song, Robert realized with a shock that sent chills down his spine that he had heard this exact melody before, sung in this same nursery by the only other person who had ever been able to comfort him during his darkest moments. Elizabeth had hummed this same tune during her pregnancy, especially during the difficult months when complications had made her bedridden and fearful about the baby's health. She had told Robert that the melody came from her childhood, something her own mother had sung to her when she was scared or upset. Elizabeth had planned to sing it to their baby as a way of connecting him to the family history and love that would surround him from birth. But Elizabeth's death had taken that voice away, leaving James without the one sound that might have connected him to his mother's love and presence. The realization hit Robert like a physical blow. How could this young maid know a melody that Elizabeth had described as uniquely personal to her family? The tune wasn't a common lullaby, or a song that would be found in any collection of children's music. It was something intimate and specific, passed down through generations of Elizabeth's family as a way of comforting children during difficult times. Robert's mind raced through possibilities, none of which seemed to make sense given what he knew about Sarah's background and history. Sarah seemed to sense his confusion and distress, and as James continued to sleep peacefully in her arms, she began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. She told Robert that the melody had been taught to her by her grandmother, who had worked as a domestic servant for wealthy families throughout her life. Sarah's grandmother had learned the song from a woman she had cared for during a difficult pregnancy many years ago, a kind lady who had treated her with respect and dignity despite their different social positions. The pieces of an impossible puzzle began to fall into place as Sarah continued her story. Her grandmother had worked for the Morrison family in New York during the 1970s and 80s, caring for a young girl named Elizabeth, who had been born into privilege but had always shown compassion for the people who worked in her family's household. When Elizabeth had grown up and moved away, Sarah's grandmother had kept the melody as a reminder of one of the few employers who had ever seen her as a complete human being, rather than just a worker. The revelation that Sarah's grandmother had worked for Elizabeth's family created a connection that transcended social class and economic status, revealing a thread of human relationship that had been invisible to Robert until this moment. As Sarah continued to hold baby James, who remained peacefully asleep for the first time in 3 days, she shared memories that her grandmother had passed down about the Morrison family and the young girl who had grown up to become Robert's wife. Sarah's grandmother, Rose Williams, had worked for the Morrisons for nearly 15 years, starting when Elizabeth was just 7 years old. Rose had been more than a domestic employee. She had been a constant presence during Elizabeth's childhood, helping with homework, providing comfort during difficult times, and offering the kind of steady, unconditional support that Elizabeth's busy parents hadn't always been able to provide. The melody that Sarah now hummed to comfort James had been Rose's gift to Elizabeth during a particularly difficult period when the young girl was struggling with anxiety and sleep problems. Rose had taught Elizabeth that the wordless tune had been passed down through generations of women in Rose's family, a musical tradition that carried the power to soothe troubled hearts and calm restless minds. Elizabeth had found such comfort in the melody that she had asked Rose to sing it to her almost every night for several years. When Elizabeth eventually outgrew her need for bedtime songs, she had promised Rose that she would remember the tune and use it to comfort her own children someday. The connection between the families had been severed when Elizabeth went away to college, and the Morrison family eventually moved to a different city. Rose had lost touch with the girl she had helped raise, though she had followed Elizabeth's life through society pages and news articles over the years. When Rose learned about Elizabeth's marriage to Robert Hartwell, and later about her death during childbirth, she had grieved for the young woman she had loved like her own daughter. Sarah revealed that her grandmother had specifically sought out the position at the Hartwell mansion when she learned about the job opening, hoping to find some way to honor Elizabeth's memory and provide service to her widowed husband and motherless child. Rose was too elderly and frail to work in domestic service anymore, but she had encouraged Sarah to apply for the position, sharing stories about Elizabeth's kindness and expressing a hope that Sarah might find a way to bring some comfort to the grieving family. The weight of this revelation settled over Robert like a profound recognition of connections that exist beyond what money can buy or professional credentials can provide. Sarah hadn't just randomly appeared in his household. She carried with her a link to Elizabeth that preceded their marriage and transcended death. The melody that had comforted his wife as a child was now comforting his son, creating a bridge between past and present that no amount of wealth or expertise could have constructed. In the days that followed James's first peaceful night of sleep, the atmosphere in the Hartwell mansion underwent a transformation that extended far beyond the resolution of one baby's mysterious crying. Robert found himself reevaluating not just his approach to childcare, but his entire understanding of what constituted valuable knowledge and meaningful expertise. The young maid who had been instructed to remain invisible had proven herself more essential than any of the credentialed professionals he had hired. Sarah's role in the household evolved organically from general cleaning duties to a more complex position that involved regular interaction with baby James. Robert discovered that his son responded to Sarah's presence in ways that went beyond the initial comfort she had provided during his crisis. James would smile when he heard Sarah's voice in the hallway, would calm quickly when she picked him up, and would sleep more peacefully when she sang the melody that connected him to his mother's childhood. The change in baby James was remarkable and sustained. The specialists who had worked so intensively during the 36-hour crisis were amazed by the infant's transformation and wanted to document the case for medical journals. But Robert declined their requests for interviews and studies, recognizing that some experiences transcend scientific analysis, and that his son's healing was rooted in something more profound than any medical intervention could provide. As weeks passed, Robert began to see Sarah not as domestic help, but as someone who carried knowledge and wisdom that complemented rather than competed with formal education and professional training. He found himself asking for her opinions about James's development, seeking her input on decisions about the baby's care, and valuing her observations about his son's changing needs and preferences. Sarah's insights proved consistently accurate, and her suggestions often solved problems that had puzzled more credentialed advisors. The relationship between Robert and Sarah evolved into something neither of them had expected when she first arrived at the estate. It wasn't romantic or inappropriate, but it was deeply respectful and mutually beneficial. Robert gained access to a form of wisdom that his money had never been able to purchase, while Sarah found herself in a position where her natural gifts were recognized and valued by someone with the power to change her life circumstances. Robert arranged for Sarah to receive formal training in child development and early childhood education, not because she needed credentials to validate her abilities, but because he wanted to provide her with opportunities that complemented her natural talents. He also ensured that Rose Williams, Sarah's grandmother, received the medical care she needed, understanding that Sarah's peace of mind about her family directly affected her ability to provide care for his son. The transformation extended beyond the immediate household to influence Robert's broader perspective on business and social responsibility. He began to recognize expertise and wisdom in places he had previously overlooked, started listening more carefully to employees at all levels of his companies, and developed a deeper appreciation for the kinds of knowledge that come from lived experience rather than formal education alone. Today, 3 years after that 36-hour crisis, the Hartwell mansion operates with a different understanding of what constitutes valuable expertise and meaningful contribution. Sarah Williams is no longer a maid, but serves as James's primary caregiver, with responsibilities that include not just daily care, but also input on major decisions about his education and development. Her position comes with compensation that reflects the true value of her contributions, rather than the traditional wages of domestic service. Baby James, now a healthy and happy 4-year-old, shows no lasting effects from those difficult days of inconsolable crying. He has grown into a confident child who demonstrates remarkable emotional intelligence and an unusual ability to comfort others who are distressed. The melody that Sarah learned from her grandmother and that connected him to his mother's childhood remains a part of his bedtime routine, creating a bridge between generations and a source of comfort that transcends social boundaries. Rose Williams lived to see her granddaughter's life transformed and to meet the little boy who had benefited from the melody she had taught to his mother decades earlier. Before her death last year, Rose was able to share more stories about Elizabeth's childhood with Robert, helping him understand his wife's character in ways that enriched his memories and provided context for the values he wants to instill in his son. The story of how a 19-year-old maid succeeded where medical experts failed has become something of a legend within the household staff of wealthy families, though Robert has kept the details private out of respect for all involved. What matters more than the story itself is how it changed his understanding of expertise, wisdom, and the importance of recognizing valuable knowledge wherever it appears. This experience taught Robert that true problem-solving often requires looking beyond traditional credentials and being open to insights from unexpected sources. It showed him that the people we might overlook or undervalue often carry forms of wisdom that formal education cannot provide. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the most profound forms of healing and comfort sometimes come not from what we can purchase or command, but from the connections we build with others who understand our deepest needs. The sound that once broke a billionaire ultimately became the foundation for a different kind of success, one measured not in profit margins or market share, but in the depth of human connection, and the recognition that true expertise comes in many forms, often from the most unexpected places.